There are certain kinds of knowledge that become dangerous not because of what they can do, but because of what people believe they can do. In the antebellum South, where control was maintained through fear and forced ignorance, a slave who possessed knowledge became something far more threatening than a slave who possessed strength. Knowledge could not be chained, it could not be broken with a whip, and it could spread like wildfire through whispered conversations in the quarters after dark. This is the story of a woman whose understanding of the natural world grew so vast, so precise, and so undeniable that it terrified the very people who claimed to own her. A woman whose remedies could save a life one day and end one the next, depending on which plant she chose from the forest. A woman who never raised her voice, never showed defiance, yet made powerful men lock their doors at night and taste their food with trembling hands. Her name was Annie Turner, and what she knew made her the most feared slave in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. Annie Turner arrived at the Hartwell Plantation in the spring of 1838, though no one could say exactly where she had come from. She was purchased at a slave auction in Natchez by Thomas Hartwell, a cotton planter whose wealth had grown considerably in the previous decade. The records from that day, which still exist in the county archives, list her only as Annie, female, approximately 16 years, field hand. There is no mention of her previous owner, no documentation of her place of birth, nothing to indicate that she was anything other than another nameless piece of property changing hands.
But Annie was not like the other slaves who arrived at Hartwell Plantation that spring. Within her first week in the cotton fields, she demonstrated an unusual attentiveness to everything around her. While other workers focused solely on their tasks, Annie's eyes constantly moved, observing the plants growing at the edge of the fields, noting which birds visited which flowers, watching how the older slaves treated minor injuries and ailments. She collected seeds in her pockets. She touched leaves with careful fingers, sometimes bringing them to her nose to smell their essence. An elderly slave named Ruth, who had lived on the Hartwell plantation for nearly 40 years, noticed Annie's peculiar behavior first. Ruth had been the unofficial healer in the slave quarters for as long as anyone could remember, treating everything from fevers to wounds with poultices and teas made from plants she gathered in the surrounding woods. When a child named Samuel developed a persistent cough that summer, Ruth made her usual remedy, a tea brewed from wild cherry bark and honeysuckle. Annie watched Ruth prepare the medicine with an intensity that made the older woman uncomfortable. "You studyin' my methods, girl?" Ruth asked, not unkindly. "Just watching," Annie replied softly. "That cherry bark, you're using too much. It'll make him vomit before it helps the cough." Ruth's hands stopped moving. She stared at the young woman with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "And how would you know such a thing?" "The bark has a poison in it," Annie explained, her voice calm and factual. "A small amount opens the lungs. Too much turns the stomach inside out. You need half what you're using, and you should add hound herd if you can find it. White flowers, grows in the dry places near the barn." Ruth wanted to dismiss the girl's presumption, but something in Annie's tone gave her pause. There was no arrogance in her voice, no challenge. She spoke about plants the way others might speak about the weather, as simple, observable facts. Against her better judgment, Ruth reduced the amount of cherry bark and sent Annie to find the hound herd. The tea worked. Samuel's cough eased within 2 days and disappeared entirely within a week. After that, Ruth began to teach Annie everything she knew, or rather, she tried to teach her. What Ruth discovered was that Annie didn't need teaching so much as she needed access. Once shown a plant, Annie seemed to understand it completely, what it could do, how much to use, which parts held the medicine and which parts held danger. She learned the healing arts not like a student memorizing lessons, but like someone remembering something they had always known. By the fall of 1838, Annie had surpassed Ruth entirely. She treated a child's fever with willow bark tea. She stopped an infection in a field hand's cut finger using a paste made from wild garlic and pine resin. When one of the house slaves suffered terrible stomach pains, Annie brewed a tea from wild ginger root and peppermint that brought relief within an hour. The slaves in the quarters began coming to her instead of Ruth. Then they began coming to her for things Ruth had never been able to treat at all. Annie never refused anyone. She never asked for payment or favor. She simply listened to the symptoms, walked into the woods or along the creek, and returned with whatever was needed. But she did something else, too, something that no one noticed at first. She began keeping notes. Since slaves were forbidden from learning to read or write, Annie developed her own system: small marks carved into pieces of bark, patterns of pebbles arranged in hollow logs, notches cut into specific trees in specific sequences. To anyone else, these looked like random scratches and natural formations. To Annie, they were a vast library of information. She marked which plants grew where, when they flowered, how much rainfall they needed, what they could treat, and, most importantly, what they could kill. Because Annie understood something fundamental that most healers never fully grasped: the difference between a medicine and a poison was usually nothing more than a matter of amount.
One evening in late August, Thomas Hartwell ate dinner with his family as usual. The meal included greens from the kitchen garden, collards and mustard greens prepared by the cook named Betty. Hartwell ate heartily, complimenting the meal. Within an hour, he was doubled over with stomach cramps. By midnight, he was vomiting violently. By morning, his hands trembled, his vision blurred, and his heart raced irregularly. Dr. Foster was summoned. He examined Hartwell, asked questions about his symptoms, and looked genuinely perplexed. "It presents like poisoning," the doctor said quietly to Constance Hartwell, "but I cannot determine the source. Was there anything unusual about his food?" Constance immediately thought of Annie. Everyone thought of Annie, but Annie had not been in the main house in weeks. She had not prepared the meal. She had no contact with the food. Still, Constance sent for her. Annie arrived and examined Hartwell carefully. She asked questions about what he had eaten, when his symptoms had begun, what they felt like. Then she asked to see the kitchen garden. She walked among the rows of vegetables with Betty, the cook, following nervously behind. Annie stopped at the greens, knelt down, and examined them closely. Then she moved to the edge of the garden where several plants with white flowers were growing. "White snake root," Annie said, pointing to the plants. "It's been growing in the garden for weeks. Did anyone notice?" Betty shook her head. "I thought they were just weeds. They looked harmless." Annie straightened up. "The greens are growing right beside the snake root. When it rains, the poison from the snake root washes onto the vegetable leaves. It builds up over time. Master Hartwell's been eating it for days, maybe weeks. It's called milk sickness when it comes from cows that eat snake root, but people can get it directly from eating plants contaminated by it." She returned to the main house and told Dr. Foster and Constance what she had found. Then she prepared a treatment: activated charcoal from burned willow wood, bone-set tea to help his body fight the poison, and a strict diet of bland foods and clean water for at least 2 weeks. "The poison affects the heart and liver," Annie explained, her voice calm despite the terrified faces surrounding her. "If he rests completely and takes no more poison, his body can recover, but it will take time, and he will feel weak for several weeks." Thomas Hartwell recovered exactly as Annie predicted. Within 3 weeks, his symptoms had disappeared entirely. Dr. Foster, examining the white snake root himself and consulting his medical texts, confirmed that Annie's diagnosis had been correct. The incident should have vindicated Annie, should have proven her value and knowledge. Instead, it had the opposite effect, because people began to ask a different question: how did Annie know so much about poison? The fear escalates. The delegation pressures Hartwell. The decision to sell her is made. Annie learned of her impending sale in early November. She received the news with the same quiet composure she displayed when treating patients or facing suspicion. She asked only one question: when? Hampton will collect you in December, before the winter rains make the roads impassable, Hartwell told her. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. Annie nodded and returned to her cabin. She spent the following weeks continuing her work among the slaves in the quarters, treating their ailments, teaching the younger women which plants could help a difficult childbirth or reduce a fever. She gathered seeds from her garden and distributed them to those she trusted. She carved final marks on her trees, adding the last observations to her hidden library of knowledge. She did not appear afraid or angry. She simply prepared. But something strange began to happen in those final weeks before Annie's departure. Several of the white men who had been most vocal about demanding her sale began to fall ill. The mysterious illnesses among the planters, the growing paranoia. December arrived cold and gray. Morris Hampton sent word that he would come for Annie on December 15th. Hartwell informed Annie on the previous Saturday afternoon, telling her to have her meager belongings ready by morning. That Saturday night, Annie stayed in her cabin, burning a small fire despite the prohibition against slaves keeping fires unattended. No one stopped her. The other slaves in the quarters sensed that something significant was ending, and they left her to her solitude. But Annie wasn't alone for long. Around midnight, there was a quiet knock on Annie's door. When Annie opened it, she found a young slave woman named Judith standing in the darkness. Judith was 16, recently arrived at the Hartwell Plantation, and she had watched Annie with hungry attention, asking questions about plants whenever she had the chance. "I need to learn," Judith said simply. "You're leaving tomorrow, and there's no one else who knows what you know." Annie hesitated. Teaching was dangerous, for her and for the student, but she also understood that knowledge unused was knowledge lost. She opened the door wider and let Judith inside. They sat by the fire, and Annie began to teach. She spoke quickly, knowing she had limited time. She taught Judith about the common healing plants: willow for fever, yarrow for bleeding, ginger for stomach ailments. She taught her about doses and preparations, about the difference between fresh and dried herbs, about seasonal variations in plant potency. But she also taught her about the other plants, the dangerous ones. Foxglove, Annie said, can steady a failing heart in tiny amounts, but a little too much and it stops the heart entirely. Water hemlock looks like wild carrots, but eating a piece the size of your thumb will cause convulsions and death within an hour. Pokeweed berries are attractive to children, but they're poisonous, though the young leaves cooked properly are safe to eat. "Why are you telling me this?" Judith asked quietly.
Annie looked at her across the fire. "Because knowledge is the only thing they can't take from us. They can sell us, work us, beat us, but what we know stays with us. And sometimes knowing dangerous things is the same as being dangerous yourself, even if you never use what you know." "The men who got sick this month," Judith said carefully, "the ones who wanted you sold." Annie held her gaze. "I didn't touch their food or drink. I didn't go near them. I didn't do anything that could be proven, but they got sick anyway." She paused. "People get sick." She let the silence settle between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Then she continued teaching until the fire burned low and the night grew thin. When the first gray light appeared at the cabin's edges, Annie stood. "Remember what I've told you," she said. "Not just the plants, the why. The line between cure and harm is thin. Guard it carefully." Judith nodded, eyes wide and shining. Annie walked her to the door. As Judith slipped into the fading darkness, Annie watched her go, then turned back to the dying embers. She added one last small branch to the fire and sat alone until morning came. When the trader's wagon rolled up the lane later that day, Annie was waiting, quiet, composed, her small bundle in her hands. She climbed in without a word.
The wagon rolled away down the dusty road, carrying her toward Arkansas or Texas or wherever the trader decided she would go next. Behind her, the plantation continued. The cotton fields stretched on. The quarters whispered. And somewhere in the woods, in the patterns of pebbles and notches in bark, pieces of Annie Turner's knowledge remained, silent, patient, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to read them. Knowledge could not be chained. It could not be broken with a whip, and it could spread like wildfire through whispered conversations in the quarters after dark.